it seems there is no limit to their stupidity and absurdity when it comes to their Trump derangement syndrome. Hello everyone, welcome to the Steve Hilton Show. The big story this week, I'm afraid, is a disgraceful story. I don't think it's got quite enough attention. I don't think we have been clear enough about what has just happened here in America with respect to, of course, the big story that's been driving the news across the world ever since October the 7th and those absolutely horrific Hamas attacks on Israel, the barbaric attacks. Everyone says Israel has a right to defend itself, but that doesn't seem to be the case when you actually look at what's now happening. You have the media endlessly taking the side of those who want Israel to stop. Worse than that, the Biden administration, who, let's be fair, in the immediate days and weeks after the Hamas attacks, absolutely stood strongly with Israel. We said that at the time. We praised them at the time. That was good. But look what's happening now. You have the most senior Democrat in the United States Senate, Chuck Schumer, making an absolutely disgraceful speech, meddling in Israel's internal politics, telling Israel to stop, and telling Israelis to get rid of their leader. But in a way worse than that is Biden himself. First of all, he praises what Schumer said and said it's a good speech. He called it a good speech. And by the way, after all these lectures from Biden and all the others about election interference and meddling and the Russians and Trump in 2016 and all the rest of it, they're fine to meddle in Israel's politics when it suits them. But much worse than that is the decision by the United States, our country, at the United Nations, effectively to support a call for an immediate ceasefire. That's what was the consequence of this vote in the UN. Typically and correctly, the United States has vetoed these endless, year after year, the anti-Israel resolutions that are passed. We vetoed them. We said, no, we stand with Israel. Not anymore. Not with Biden. Under the Biden administration, that's all gone. And so now let's be clear what's happening when you put all this together. Schumer's speech, which Joe Biden praised as being a good speech. The decision to support effectively by abstaining. The UN resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire. And then what Biden himself has been saying. Do you remember in that appalling press conference, the shambolic press conference of the White House after the Hur report, saying that Israel's response is over the top? And then more recently, you have Jake Sullivan saying they should find another way to beat Hamas. What other way? Very clear signal from the United States that Israel should not go into Rafah, where the remainder of the Hamas terrorists, the criminals, are based now. That's where they've run away to. As always, using the Palestinian people, they're using their own people as human shields. That's what they do, the hundreds of miles of tunnels we now know. They're in Rafah, they're hiding out. Israel's done a great job so far prosecuting this war. They've destroyed, on some estimates, roughly half of the Hamas military operation. That means there's half of it left. The war is half won, you could say, or half lost. And that is where the United States now stands. Disgracefully, shamefully, the official position of the Biden administration is for Israel to lose this war against Hamas. That is their position. Whatever they say, that is their position. They claim that they still support Israel. They just care about the humanitarian consequences of how they're prosecuting this war. What a load of absolute crap. Read an article in the New York Times by David Brooks. David Brooks goes through in detail all the challenges to what Israel's doing and goes through it and say, well, should they be doing this? Should they be doing that? Couldn't they be doing it a different way? What are the alternatives? And the answer is no. And he's talked to a huge number of experts in urban warfare, in our military across the world, about what the possibility is to defeat Hamas, other than what Israel is doing. And he, in this article, by the way, David Brooks is not some right-wing nut job. He's a never-Trumper, a very mainstream columnist, been there for years. I don't always agree with him, but he very, very objectively, faithfully, clearly went through all the objections to what Israel is doing, speaking to experts around the world who really know how you prosecute these campaigns. He said there's no other way of doing it. And by the way, Israel is bending over backwards to avoid civilian casualties. He quotes people saying that Israel is doing far more to avoid civilian casualties in Gaza than the US ever did in Iraq or Afghanistan. under Biden, let's remember. So it's just utterly shameful and outrageous that they're now saying, well, we can't take it anymore. We can't take the pressure. What is that pressure? It is the political pressure. The political pressure for Biden's re-election. That's what's driving all of this. They see what happened in Michigan. They see the polls showing young people running away from the Democratic Party because of Biden's previous stance on Israel. So what do? They totally cave. Why? Because Biden is what I've always said, a totally pathetic, unprincipled machine politician. That's why Biden is running away from Israel. That's why Biden disgracefully is now happy for Hamas to win this war. For whatever his fancy words, that's Biden's position now. That is his official position because he has no principles. He has no shame. He'll do whatever he needs to advance his political interests. That has been the story of his career, a totally unprincipled machine politician. And now we see that play out in the most despicable way. And if you want to know the consequences of all this, there's another fantastic article, this time in the Wall Street Journal, by French author and philosopher Bernard-Henri Lévy. And I'm going to read you what he says because it's so well argued and so important for us to understand. This is from the article. If the current US policy, which is telling Israel not to pursue the war, not to go into Rafah, to effectively capitulate, Hamas would declare victory on the verge of defeat, then the next minute revived. These criminals against humanity would emerge from their tunnels triumphant after playing with the lives not only of the 250 Israelis captured on October the 7th, but also of their own citizens whom they transformed into human shields. The Arab street would view Hamas terrorists as resistance fighters. In Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, nations that signed the Abraham Accords or were leaning toward doing so, Hamas's prestige would be enhanced. In the West Bank, as in Gaza, Hamas would quickly eclipse the corrupt and ineffective Palestinian Authority, whose image would pale next to the twin aura of martyrdom and endurance in which Hamas would cloak itself. After that, no diplomatic or military strategy would prevail against the iron law of people converted into mobs and mobs into packs. None of the experts' extravagant plans for an international stabilization force, an interim Arab authority, or technocratic government presiding over the reconstruction of Gaza would stand long against the blast effect created by the last-minute return of this group of criminals adorned with the most heroic of virtues. Hamas would be the law in Palestinian territories. It would set the ideological and political agenda, regardless of the formal structure of the new government. And Israel will never deal with the Palestinian Authority, of which Hamas is a part. Goodbye, Palestinian state. Hope for peace, harbored by moderates on both sides, will be dead. Those who portray themselves as praying for the end of this war and a negotiated peace on the day after must recognize there is only one path to that end. First, the release of all hostages, next, the evacuation of civilians from the zone of imminent combat. When will the world recognize that Israel, having been forced into this war, is doing more than any army ever did to prevent civilian deaths? And finally, in Rafah, the destruction of what remains of Hamas and its death squads. Without this military victory, the endless wheel of misfortune will begin to spin yet again, though faster. This is the terrible truth. It is the terrible truth. And Biden, pathetically, shamefully, disgracefully, won't recognize it, will run away from it, anything to save his political skin. In the meantime, sacrificing honor and decency and the hopes of peace in the Middle East. All right, for our policy conversation this week, I want to talk about a new policy document that we published at my organization, Golden Together, on housing. Housing, I've talked about it a lot before because it's a foundational issue. It is the problem that underlies so many of the other problems here in California and actually across the country. Housing costs are just getting out of control. And a lot of the time, this is portrayed as just the fault of zoning laws and NIMBYs. You hear that word NIMBYs all the time. Not in my backyard, people who don't want housing built. And it's true that we don't have enough housing built. And that is one of the reasons that the prices are so high. I mean, here in California now, we have the highest housing costs in America and the lowest home ownership. $820,000 is the median house price, the typical house price. Only 18% of Californians can afford that. It is completely ridiculous. It used to be the California dream. You come here, You start your life, you work hard, you buy a home, raise your family. That's completely gone. It's ridiculous. The rents are off the charts. No one can get on the housing ladder. And yes, partly that is because there is not enough housing being built. We're millions and millions of homes short. And that's why the laws of supply and demand dictate that the prices go up when there's not enough supply. But that's not just because some people don't want housing built in their neighborhoods. It's because you've got artificial restrictions on what housing can be built. And that's what we address in our policy report and all the other reasons housing is so out of control. Number one, you've got something called the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, passed in 1970. Governor Ronald Reagan, signed it. And when it started out, it was well intentioned about protecting the environment. But over the years, it's morphed into this absolute nightmare that basically stops anything being built. And the main reason it's such a nightmare is that the courts, not the politicians through the democratic process, the courts created this thing called the private right of action, which means that anyone can sue, anyone can bring a lawsuit to block anything from being built. And right now in California, you've got over 1 million homes blocked by these lawsuits. And who's filing the lawsuits? It's not environmental groups mainly that are doing this. It's actually the unions. The unions file lawsuits to block housing, to use as leverage to extract concessions, higher wages, the forced use of union workers as labor, etc. It is a scam. And so the first thing we're arguing for is the abolition of this private right of action. So you can't have this exploitation, this abuse of our environmental laws to block housing. But the second thing that's going on is that house prices are being artificially inflated through hidden taxes. This is when you talk to people about housing in California, and this is true across the country as well, no one even knows about this. They're called impact fees, but it's really a stealth tax on house building. So when you try and build a house, the house builder, a developer, they have to pay fees to state agencies, to the local council for the privilege of building a house or an apartment block or whatever it may be. And the name impact fees relates to the fact that originally there's a good reason for this. There's an impact. When you build new housing, there is an impact on the local community. You need roads and you need utilities and parks and so on. And so that has to be paid for. And so this has been a way to contribute towards that. Of course, you still have property taxes that are supposed to pay for this and general taxes. So impact fees were an extra way of doing that. But now they've been used as a stealth tax. They've absolutely exploded. Across the state of California, it's typical to have impact fees of $150,000, $200,000 per housing unit. So of course that goes right onto the price. In one city, you were seeing impact fees of $300,000 per apartment unit. So of course the developers only build housing that rich people can afford because they've got to pay all these taxes. So the second part of our proposal caps impact fees. But there's a third thing that's going on. And in a way, this is the most serious. This whole conversation about housing, certainly in California and in other blue states, has got completely taken over by climate extremism. So you've got this ideology which is now being applied, which says you cannot build anywhere except on the existing boundaries of developed land. You can't do anything else because that adds to climate. You can't have suburban sprawl because it means that people are going to be driving more and that's bad for climate, and on and on. All these arguments that are really ideological, not practical. But we're never going to deal with the housing crisis we have, the shortage of homes, unless we expand where we build. And actually here in California, there's so much land to build on. Only 5% of our land is currently developed, 5%. If you increase that to 6%, you could create homes, single family homes, on comfortable lots of a quarter of an acre each for 10 million people. I mean, we're not even proposing that. What we are proposing is we've got to end this war on suburbs and single family homes. We've got to have a policy of housing choice. Some people will want to live maybe when they're younger in the city in an apartment with all the services there provided for them and right in the thick of the action. That's great. And we should be encouraging that. But when people get a bit older and they want to start a family, often they do want to live in a single family home. And what's wrong with that? Why should we deny that to people? So that's what we lay out in this policy report. The report's called Universal Housing Affordability. That's what we should be aiming for, to make it affordable for everyone. Housing is just a basic component. No wonder everyone's feeling the pinch with inflation and all the rest of it when housing costs are so massive. It's a massive part of everyone's budget. So that's what we lay out here, a policy that allows people to live the lives they want, to choose the housing they want, and to be able to afford it. Housing choice, homeowner autonomy. We can build and build and build new sustainable suburbs that are modern and beautiful and people want to live in. And we can make our cities fantastic. But we've got to have a mindset of abundance. We can do these things. We can provide the energy. We can provide the water. We can use innovation and technology to make things better. We don't have to have this grim negative ideology of scarcity, that everything must be limited and controlled, and people can't live, and they shouldn't have families, and they shouldn't have homes, and they should live in tiny little apartments because of climate change. There are better ways to meet our climate goals and to reduce emissions than denying opportunity to working class families who right now cannot get on the housing ladder, cannot afford to live the California dream here in this state, or in fact, in many other states run by Democrats, captured by this far left ideology. We need to build more housing. We need to do it here in California. We need to do it right across the country. And if you read our report, go to goldentogether.com. You'll see specific ideas for how we bring that about. All right, back for California Corner this week is our friend Susan Shelley. Do you know what, Susan? I want to start with something that is not California, but we are always so proud when one of your brilliant pieces makes a splash nationally, as they often do. You write for the New York Post as well as Orange County Register and other Southern California outlets. And this was a piece you wrote about one of the Trump prosecutions. And it had a huge, it went viral, as they say. So tell us about this piece. It was really interesting. I learned a lot.
Well, when the New York judge decided to fine Donald Trump basically all the cash he had and then some to virtually ensure that he would not be able to appeal, because in New York you have to put up a bond for the full amount of the fine in order to appeal the judgment. When he did that, and it was $454 billion with additional interest accruing every day, I looked at that and I thought to myself, I'm going to check the Eighth Amendment and see if it has a clause in it that says, accept Trump. Because the Eighth Amendment prohibits excessive fines. And I looked up the Supreme Court case most recently that decided whether this applies to the states as well as the federal government, because originally the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states, and piece by piece the court made it apply to the states. I checked the piece on excessive fines. 2019 was the year. The case is Timbs versus Indiana, TIMBS. It's a gentleman's name, Timbs versus Indiana. And what it was about was he had a $10,000 fine that he owed for a drug-related offense. And the court, or the state of Indiana rather, wanted to seize his $42,000 car, which he bought with insurance proceeds, not with drug proceeds. And the Indiana court said, it's an excessive fine. And the Indiana Supreme Court overturned that and said, yes, but the excessive fines clause doesn't apply to the states. And it went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said in 2019, yes, it does apply to the states. It absolutely applies to the states exactly as it applies to the federal government. Excessive fines are prohibited. And then there's a long definition of proportionality and the rest of it. And the decision was written, it was unanimous, and it was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And so I wrote a column about it. I said, here's how Ruth Bader Ginsburg just saved Donald Trump $455 million. And because of the citations that I had in there, because I have a footnote fetish, as you know, because I had all of the citations to the different decisions, I think it was passed around to the lawyers, some of whom were representing Trump, and it ended up in his hands. And so he posted a link to it on Truth Social a couple of weeks later, and also texted it to Larry Kudlow at Fox Business, who talked about it on the air. And so there's been a lot of traffic to that column.
Amazing. What brilliant legal sleuthing, Susan. That's so impressive. And I love it reminds me how much, I revere this country and our constitution, that actually we can go back and actually establish facts and the law and insist that they're followed. There's something about that whole story you've just told that I find deeply, deeply, moving, actually. So where does this fit in? Because since that, we've had that initial bond payment fine, or whatever you want to call it, reduced to whatever it is now, 175 million, still enormous. But your point applies to the eventual judgment after appeal. Is that correct?
That's correct. Well, I believe what the former president's lawyers are doing now is going through the New York courts to appeal the judgment itself and various flaws in that trial. All flaws, all flaws, nothing but flaws in
Right.
that trial. So if they get the judgment reversed by the New York courts, that's the end of it, I
Hmm.
believe. And if they don't get the judgment reversed by the New York courts, then they can go to the U.S. Supreme Court and they can
Based on what
argue that
you've
this
laid
is an
out.
excessive.
Yes.
It's also
Brilliant.
due process violations, but it's an excessive fine by any
Wonderful.
definition.
Yeah, yeah, everyone agreed. Fantastic. Love that. All right, let's let's move on to California. This is just a quick one. I just want to note something. We've talked about Proposition 1, Gavin Newsom's flagship proposal, a lot. We've talked about the substance. You were the first to really educate me and our audience on exactly what was in it. We've talked about how it was barely hanging on by a thread. They finally got it across the line. So it's now passed. This initiative has passed. I'll just say one thing about it, and then I'd love your comment, and then we'll move on. Okay, fine. He's got it across the line. It was a totally, massively unexpected. This, the narrowness of the victory. You can hardly even call it a victory. Huge amount of money spent for it, no money against it, and yet it was basically 50-50. So, all right, he's got this. It was sold to us as this is what, once we pass this, we will solve the homelessness crisis. This is it. We'll take care of it. All the things that we've seen running rampant for years, the homelessness, the mental health crisis, drug addiction, the street, all on our streets and the crime associated with it. He said that this would solve that problem. Okay, let's see. And let's really hold them accountable.
Good luck. He'll be gone, and the money will be gone, and we'll be paying it back for 30 years with interest. And it's going to be $12 billion for what they say is 11,100 beds, thereabouts. And, if we get 5,000 beds out of it by the time they finish sending out those contracts for bids and then giving everything to the highest bidder, not the lowest bidder, I think by the time they get finished, it'll be like every other
Yes,
bond for homelessness or spending for homelessness. It'll produce much, much less than was promised
yes.
because there's never going to be enough money to solve the homelessness problem by promising everyone on the streets their own studio apartment at taxpayer expense with full wraparound services that they don't have to use. Because under state law, you don't have to use it. You can stay in these beds for treatment without having any treatment.
They've elevated this so much that there's no hiding anymore, right? This is it. Like, of course, we all know that unless you change the actual policies that have driven this, housing first, the refusal to have mental health facility, I call it the Susan Shelley
Right.
3-point plan for solving the crisis. Unless they do that, you're not going to solve the problem. You can't just sort of throw more money at the same broken system with the same bad policies. However, that's what they're insisting. This is the fight. In a way, it's like, okay, there's nowhere to hide after this, right? It'll be very evident that you have to change direction.
Well, one thing that might change it is a Supreme Court case that is
The
under
grants pass,
consideration right
yeah.
now in Grants Pass, exactly. And they are very likely to overturn Martin versus Boise, which is the, I believe, 2018 case that said you cannot enforce a ban on sleeping on the sidewalk unless you have enough shelter beds for everyone. And then there's no definition of what a shelter bed is. So in California, they define it as a studio apartment with wraparound services, $800,000 per unit to construct them. And then you have to pay to operate them after that. So there's never going to be enough money to cover this problem. It's not just about poverty. It's not just about housing prices in California. It's also about drug addiction, mental health, and
Hmm.
people coming in from other states for these very lax policies on everything that we have. So you can't catch up, and that's the problem with it.
Well, just actually, I said would move on, but just on that, when do we expect grant? Is that this session, grants pass
That's the
Oregon?
session. I would expect that by the end of June.
And if that is overturned, if Boise is overturned, that gives, what does that exactly mean
It
operationally?
takes away the excuse that the cities have used to not enforce the laws against sleeping on the sidewalk and doing everything else on the sidewalk. They don't enforce the laws because they say the Supreme Court, the federal courts won't let us.
Hmm.
Well, it's true right now that they do get sued for every kind of enforcement action that they take in a city with deep pockets. In a city like Los Angeles, they get sued for every kind of enforcement, and they have been sued, and so there's some validity to their argument. But if Martin versus Boise is overturned, then they lose the ability to say that, and they will have to enforce the laws on the books or explain to the voters why they won't.
So it doesn't require them to enforce it. It just removes an excuse for not enforcing it.
Exactly.
We will see. Okay. Could you give us an update on the initiative that you've been working on? And we've talked again about before, but that's all. There's a process around that. Outrageously, this is an initiative that you and your organization and your allies qualified for the ballot, the Taxpayer Protection. Am I getting right? And Government Accountability Act.
Exactly. Taxpayer protection and government accountability. And those are the two reasons that the government opposes it.
I
And
mean,
the government is suing to have it taken off the ballot, which is really astonishing. These are the
it's a
people who say
stunning
we're
thing.
for
I
democracy,
know.
and they are suing to have a duly qualified initiative removed from the ballot before the voters have the opportunity to pass it. What does it do? It protects taxpayers. It makes the government accountable for all of these fees and things that they're always delegating off to agencies, and then they can tell the voters, oh, I didn't do it. I didn't charge you that. That was the California Public Utilities Commission, or that was the Department of Water Resources. That was the California Air Resources Board. We didn't do that. We wouldn't raise your fees and taxes. Puts an end to that game. It makes every fee accountable because the government is accountable for every fee because some elected body has to vote to approve these various fees. It also requires a vote of the people to raise state taxes. So after it passes in the legislature and is signed by the governor, a state tax increase needs voter approval. And it closes a bunch of loopholes in Proposition 13 that the courts have opened up. The courts have said that if a tax increase is put on the ballot by a citizen's initiative, people with clipboards collecting signatures, maybe the Constitution doesn't apply. And it doesn't need a 2/3 vote to pass. Maybe it passes with a simple majority. Well, there are about 7, maybe after the March election, maybe 9 taxes that have passed this way that should have needed a 2/3 vote, got less than that. Under the Taxpayer Protection Act, they would all have to go back on the ballot for 2/3 voter approval, or they would be canceled, because that's what the Constitution says. So what's the government doing? The governor and the legislature are suing because they don't want you to be able to vote on that. And this is just deplorable. The latest update is that the briefs have all been filed in the California Supreme Court. This went directly to the Supreme Court on an original writ, and all the briefs are filed. They're going to schedule oral arguments. The last thing I saw is the court checking for conflicts with all the lawyers. So that will be probably in May or June, and we should have a decision by June 27th.
Is that the end of their session? Is that the
That's the
reason for
date
that
that the
date?
Secretary of State needs to know what's going to be on the ballot and what's
Right. Well, I
not
was going
going
to
to be on the
say, I mean,
ballot.
that there surely is a real world deadline here, which is, we need to know, and also you need to have the chance to mount a proper campaign.
That's a very good point. They might be doing this just to interfere with the campaign, with the fundraising, try to hold people up, because you do need a lot of money to campaign if you're going to do a statewide initiative that's opposed by every government official
Well,
and all of the people who are indebted to them
exactly,
and
all the
rely on them.
unions and all the exactly right.
Right.
It is amazing just to note. I mean, you mentioned it, but let's just underline it. Um, these are the people who never stop lecturing us about our democracy and threats to undermine our democracy. They are literally trying to stop voters from having a say
That's
on a
exactly what
policy
they're
that they
doing.
don't like, even
Right.
though you have gone through all the steps set out in this, is it in the Constitution, the steps for getting an initiative on the
It
ballot? You've
is
done
in
all
the
that,
Constitution. This
you know.
goes back to 1911. This is the direct democracy power of initiative.
Amazing. They're shameless. They really are shameless.
Yes, they are. And they don't want taxpayer protection and they don't want government accountability. And that's the
Very,
bottom line on the whole thing.
very simply and beautifully put. All right, last one. Um, Update on Los Angeles homelessness. There's an audit in the offing for all this money that clearly isn't solving the problem.
This is going to be very interesting. There have been nothing but lawsuits over this homelessness policy going back to about 2003. And the latest one was from the LA Alliance for Human Rights, I think is the full name. They sued the city over not providing housing for the people who are living on the downtown sidewalks. And there was a settlement in 2022. And of course, the city has not lived up to the terms of the settlement. So now the LA Alliance has gone back to court and they have asked the judge to levy a $6.4 million fine on the city for failure to comply with the terms of the settlement. Well, the judge, I don't believe, has ordered that penalty, but he did order an audit. And he did say that prior to Mayor Bass coming into office, the city had spent/wasted $600 million of money that was supposed to be housing people. and there's no accounting for it. There's no how many did you house,
Hmm.
no outcomes, no data, no nothing. So he wants an audit of that. And this year, there's $250 million in the budget for Mayor Karen Bass's Inside Safe program, which is housing people in hotels. Again, very, very expensive, and no data, no outcomes, no record of success. And now Proposition 1 is going to put another $2 billion into exactly this kind of thing.
Hmm.
It's a $6.4 billion bond, but $2 billion is just for housing of this type, Project Home Key hotel conversion housing. And we have no idea that we have no record of success. We have no data at all, no outcomes. Well, Judge David Carter has ordered an audit of Los Angeles homelessness spending
Yeah.
with a wide scope, and hopefully we will see if there's anything we're doing that's working, and so we can ramp that up and hopefully cut the things that are not working.
I mean, by the way, this reminds us how important some of these statewide positions are, because this was the state controller. I remember talking to Lan Chen when he's running for that. Sadly, didn't win. But the state controller can go in and actually call in all this kind of
Yes.
spending and have an audit, and that's why you need a real watchdog there.
You do need a watchdog, and we have a city controller who said he would audit Inside Safe separately, but he's very far to the left, way to the left of
Yes.
Karen Bass, left of everybody.
No,
And
he's
even
a real.
he thought it needs to be audited. So there you go. It's pretty much nonpartisan wide
I know.
agreement that we're wasting a lot of money.
Just as a little aside, and then we'll leave it there. I was in Orange County last week, and I ran into Rick Caruso, who obviously ran against Karen Bass for LA mayor. And that morning, I'd seen some video that Bill Malugin from Fox News had shot of, appalling scenes, that day of appalling scenes of homelessness in LA. No change at all. Nearly 2 years after she came in, promising to deal with this. And I said to Rick Caruso, "Oh, I bet there's a lot of people in LA wish they'd voted for you for mayor now." And he said, "Yeah, so do I."
It's a challenging situation. If the Supreme Court ruling in the Grants Pass case comes in and overturns Martin versus Boise, that will remove one set of obstacles and excuses. But really, we need to do what we've talked about before. We need to build emergency and long-term shelters. We need to repeal housing first so that the housing can be given to people who are ready to get well and succeed. And then we have to build hospitals for people who need mental health care. We have to build hospitals, not these little facilities with fewer than 16 beds, which is what you currently can get matching funds to compensate the state for. What we need is to have a waiver from the ban on matching funds for large hospitals. And we can get a waiver from the federal government, but the governor won't ask for one. That's what we
Yes.
need. We need hospitals, we need to repeal housing first, and we need to build shelters.
And that waiver on the mental health, probably one of the reasons they won't do it is because that was the possibility that was introduced by the Trump administration, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
So there you are. That's probably why they don't like
Dr.
it.
Ben Carson, when he was the head of Health and Human Services, made this available under the Trump administration. And many states have applied for waivers, and California has applied for some waivers, but they're very limited. California does not want to build large hospitals, but there are people who need medical care, and they need to be patients, not tenants, because they are not well, and they deserve safe medical care. And what we're doing now is we're letting them live on the streets and calling that a civil right, and then if they hurt someone, then we arrest them and they get to be mental health patients in jail. And the LA County jails are the largest mental health hospital facility in the United States, which is appalling. And we have to do better than that.
And Prop 1 won't, just remind us, do that because?
Prop 1 will build more of these facilities that have fewer than 16 beds, so they'll all be very expensive. And of course, they'll all be constructed with labor at the prevailing wage to protect the union jobs. So they'll all cost a lot. And then the housing component, it's more of these little hotels that are converted to housing, and that's very expensive too. And then the counties lose the funding
Yes.
that they've been relying on to provide mental health services. They lose 30% of their funding, plus another 5% that goes to the state. They have to take that 30% and put it into Project Home Key projects, and then they don't get federal matching funds for providing healthcare services. So they lose three different ways. The third way they lose is they have to provide the services at these treatment facilities that the state is going to build with the bond money. So what are we going to see in November? Probably tax increases on our ballots because the counties are losing all this funding for services that are very important.
Unless we pass taxpayer protection, and then we can guard against the tax increase.
If we pass the Taxpayer Protection Act, then these taxes will require a 2/3 vote. So
Exactly.
the counties will have to make a strong case to the voters that
There
they're
you
going
are.
to use the money well.
Well, Susan Shelley, you are the watchdog California needs. Thank you so much for doing all
Thank you,
this and
Steve.
being with us. Great to see you as always. Joining us for Candidate Corner today, I'm very excited to welcome someone you will know well if you've been a regular of this show, because he's joined us many times before. He previously ran for Attorney General of California, and now he is running to replace George Gascon as District Attorney of Los Angeles County, um, by certainly the most notorious DA in the country, the absolute symbol of all the far left nonsense that has brought such havoc and destruction to our cities. And Nathan Hochman emerged from a field of many, many candidates to be the challenger. So he is now all set in November to take on George Gascon. And I think you have the hopes, Nathan, not just of Los Angeles, but the whole country with you in this quest.
Well, thank you very much for having me on, Steve. And again, it should be a great, great election. George Gascon ended up getting about 25% of the vote, which means that 75% of the people in Los Angeles County rejected George Gascon. And my mission between now and November 5th, the general election, is to unify that opposition. It's Republicans, Independents, it's Democrats, and they are all said enough is enough. They're looking at the violent crime increasing every single year in George Gascon's tenure, property crimes out of control, shoplifting up 81%. They're looking at homelessness skyrocketing, fentanyl poisoning, killing more 18 to 35-year-olds than anything else. And they're basically saying, look, we want a candidate that's going to hold criminals accountable again and get it right. I'm going to be that candidate, unify the opposition, and if the polling holds, beat George Gascon by over 20 points on November 5th.
That's what we need. Very good. I think, honestly, it's like everywhere I go in Los Angeles, people, exactly as you say, of all political persuasions, just say enough is enough. We've got to make a change. This is ridiculous. It's gone way too far. Could I ask you, before we get into the dynamics of the race, and what's going on. And I'm interested in the comparison between LA and San Francisco, where we had some really interesting results on the crime issue in the primaries the other week. But just for those who haven't heard you before and haven't met you, could you just lay out for us what you've done in the past in your career and why you think you'd be good for this job?
So I have 34 years of criminal justice experience. I graduated Stanford Law School, clerked for a federal judge, went right to the U.S. Attorney's Office. I was there for 7 years, prosecuted over 100 cases, ranging from narcotics traffickers and violent gang members to international money launderers, corrupt politicians, and actually dirty cops. Ran the environmental crimes unit and went after air, sea, and land polluters. Thereafter, President George W. Bush appointed me to be the Assistant U.S. Attorney General running the U.S. Department of Justice's Tax Division. I got unanimous Senate confirmation, which I'm actually quite proud of, and had the chance to run a $100 million budget with a litigating division having 350 lawyers doing cases across the nation. When I got done with that, I came back to Los Angeles. I ran 2 major international law firms, government investigations practices, and along the way was the president of the LA City Ethics Commission, as well as a co-founder of the LA Sheriff's Foundation. So it gives me the background to actually do the job from day one. And in comparison, George Gascon has never personally prosecuted or defended a criminal case in his entire life. I prosecuted over 100 of them and defended over 200 of them, and can lead the over 900 people who work for the DA's office by example, not by fiat, as George Gascon has tried to do.
Well, exactly. I mean, we've talked about this before, and we've talked with others who've been focused on Los Angeles from a crime perspective. I mean, Gascon walked it. First of all, he was appointed by Gavin Newsom, so his whole career in this world, Gavin Newsom, as mayor of San Francisco, appointed him San Francisco DA. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, he was first appointed San Francisco police chief.
Right.
Then he got elevated to San Francisco DA. And what's incredible is he's never actually had a client. I mean, imagine a lawyer who's never defended, had a client either on defense or even a client representing the people. I mean, he's never been in the court prosecuting any type of case in his entire life. Yet somehow he's in charge of over 900 people in Los Angeles. It was hundreds of people in San Francisco. And he showed the sort of arrogance of his position, where on the first day he was in office back in 2020, he issues 9 special directives telling those 900 people, put aside your thousands of years of collective wisdom and prosecutorial experience, and I'll tell you how to get the job done by not holding prisoners and defendants accountable for their actions and somehow that's going to make us more safe. Problem with that is that the statistics don't lie, and he has failed.
That's exactly what I was referring to, that he just went in there on day one. And these extreme policies that he just, laid down from on high, they weren't things that he spoke about in the election. These weren't election promises that he was implementing. He kept that from the voters. He talked in generality, didn't he, about how he would do his job.
Right. I mean, the generality was that he was going to not prosecute violent and serious offenders to the full extent of the law. What that turned out to be is that he won't file certain enhancements. So if you use a gun in LA County, it's as if you didn't use the gun. If you're part of a gang and committing the crime, it's as if you weren't part of the gang. He's done his best to get rid of the three strikes law. In fact, we actually, myself and my law firm, took him to court on behalf of those 900 prosecutors. We got a preliminary injunction. We got an appellate court to affirm that, telling George Gascon he can't be an unreviewable sovereign. I mean, actually, that's the language of the opinion. He's now gone to the California Supreme Court to get his sovereignty and his discretion validated, which I don't think they will absolutely do. But again, that's the arrogance of George Gascon. He
Yes.
really thinks he knows better than everyone else. But the problem is that his promises, which he had in 2020, and the voters were voting on promises, have failed. So now he has to run on a record in 2024. And again, I thoroughly believe that 2/3 of the voters are going to look at George Gascon from across the political spectrum and reject him.
Because you see the impact. It all flows down, because if the system is not prosecuting criminals, and you're removing all these enhancements for drugs and gangs and all the things that are used by law enforcement to actually enforce the law enforcement itself is demoralized. So we hear a lot about defunding of the police, but it's a demoralizing thing when you know that, what's the point of pursuing criminals and putting yourself on the line and going out there to keep the streets safe if once you get someone, the DA, through these far left policies, just doesn't actually impose any consequences.
It's a great point. In fact, Gascon has rejected and not listened to the three major stakeholders in the criminal justice system. Let's start with those 900 prosecutors. 98% of them voted to support his recall
Right.
because he basically isn't listening to them. They're completely demoralized. The senior ones have left the office. The junior ones want to leave the office. And we need to bring back the morale in the DA's office. Second major stakeholder are the law enforcement. We got tens of thousands of police officers that just want to do their job. They want to investigate the case, present that evidence to the DA's office, and have the DA's office do their job. But when they find out the DA's office is declining these cases, is declining righteous cases that they got the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, completely demoralizing. And they're having recruitment problems and maintaining just the people they have. And the third group are the victims. I mean, I can't tell you how many victim groups I speak with that basically say that George Gascon has abandoned them. He won't have prosecutors go to parole hearings when victim families have to confront the murderer of their relative and then murderers trying to get off early. For 40 years, prosecutors used to go with victim families, but George Gascon stopped that on his day one, and I would restart that on my day one.
So I want to ask you to comment now on the contrast between San Francisco and LA. Obviously, LA vastly a bigger a jurisdiction, LA County compared to San Francisco County. I mean, 10 million people versus, what is it, 700,000. So they're not alike in that sense. But they both had these far left DAs, Soros backed, and by the so-called progressive DA movement. You had at the same time, you had Gascon in LA, you had Chesa Boudin in San Francisco. San Francisco, it seems to me, the revolt against these far left policies has come earlier and gone further. First of all, you had the recall of Chesa Boudin, which was successful. He's replaced by someone who's, it seems to me, Brooke Jenkins, to be fair, is much more focused on holding criminals accountable. And then just recently, we had these really stunning results in ballot initiatives just in San Francisco, enhancing police powers to pursue criminals, requiring people who are addicted to drugs to go through treatment before receiving city services. That's a big part of street crime and retail theft, of course. So you could call it, tough on crime measures coming back in San Francisco. In LA, where do you think things stand? It seems to me that George Gascon hasn't. Is there any sign of let's just take him, of a course correction from him in light of the actual results of these policies?
Absolutely not. Let me give you the best example. January 16th of this year, 2024, George Gascon had the chance to appoint a new chief of staff. Now, you would think that since he has no experience, he'd want the most experienced person in the DA's office. You would think that since the relationships with law enforcement are quite rocky, he would want someone with excellent relationships with law enforcement. Instead, the person he elevated was Tiffany Blacknell. She has absolutely no experience as a prosecutor. In fact, she spent her years as a deputy public defender. And in 2020, she posted on her social media herself wearing a t-shirt that said the police are trained to kill us and referred to the police as barbarians and an occupying army. So George Gascon has doubled down on the very, very extreme far left position that basically thinks that letting criminals off, not holding them accountable, not bringing charges in the front end and letting them off their prison sentences on the back end is the correct method, is the correct course. He's not going to make a course correction. He doesn't look at San Francisco and see what's going on there and saying, look, that is coming down to Los Angeles. I mean, you think about it, in San Francisco, there's only 8% Republicans. I
Yeah.
mean, it's 92% Democrats and independents. In LA County, you have roughly between 18 and 20% Republicans. But that march in San Francisco was a firm statement that enough is enough.
Yes.
And I think that's exactly what's going to happen in LA. Even though George Gascon's trying to politicize the race and make it Democrats versus Republicans, I think when it comes to people's safety, people look at that old saying that criminals don't ask for your party affiliation before
Right.
they rob you. And neither do I think voters are going to ask for a party affiliation. And by the way, I'm running as an independent because it's a nonpartisan position. I want to basically walk the walk. And I'm going to run an independent DA's office, taking politics out of that office and focusing just on results for everybody, Republicans, Democrats, independents. That is the way the DA's office had been run for years. George Gascon has introduced a political agenda instead of the facts and the law being sort of these North Stars on making decisions. And I'll get rid of that political agenda from day one.
So I want to come back to the party question in a second, but just before we leave Gascon, this is always, it's such a difficult thing to do, to put yourself in someone's position when it's so extreme as this. But I'm just so curious, like the results are so clear. It's so obvious to any normal person that this approach has completely failed. How does he justify it? I mean, what do you think is going on with him that he really is, as you say, doubling down?
Well, I think the reason he got his 25% of the vote, putting aside the people who just voted for, blankly whoever the current DA is that he is beholden to the extreme progressive far left, the
Uh-huh.
George Soros, progressive left donors, the people for whom this is their ideology. And they represent, that slice, probably a quarter of the vote, somewhere between 18 and 25% of the vote. He doesn't want to lose them. He knows he can't run on his experience. He knows he can't run on his record. So he's got to run on this political agenda. The problem is that in 2020, he was able to sort of convince people with his promises that the political agenda would make them safer. The problem in 2024 is that people have woken up. They've
Yes.
basically seen that, look, this political agenda isn't making them safer, that his policies of basically favoring criminals over victims didn't make sense in 2020, but people were willing to give it a chance.
Hmm.
They've given it 3.5 years. It's failed, and they're going to throw him out of office in 2024.
So can I ask about the those who ran in the primary, and you came out pretty clearly on top? There are a number of them. Many of them impressive people from the DA's office and so on. Impressive people. There was a good choice, actually. I remember thinking this is an interesting race. I mean, I know you, and if I'd had a vote, I'd have voted for you. But um, I just wondered what your relationship is with those people. They all are basically on the same page as you, arguing for major changes. Are you going to be able to work with them? How's that going to pan out? Because I felt that it was an impressive field, actually.
So I believe I'm going to be able to work with each and every one of them. There were 9 Democrats, one Republican. I ran as an independent, but everyone is, well, aside from one person who entered the race at the very end, basically came down with an anti-Gascon agenda
Yes.
and called Gascon's policies failures, called Gascon incompetent. And again, that included the 9 Democrats. So I've already reached out to all of them. And I believe I'm going to unify that opposition, which will be tremendous
Yes.
because it'll really convey, especially the 4 people who are in his office right now and who had the bravery and the courage to run against their boss. They're going to basically, hopefully, all come out on behalf of my candidacy because they understand that what I'm going to bring back to that office is not only accountability for criminals, but listening to the deputy district attorneys that I'll be
Hmm.
leading. My
Great.
management philosophy, was actually summed up by a statement on Ronald Reagan's desk. And it said, in essence, that you can do great things in this world if you don't care who gets the credit.
Yes.
If you've ever seen a George Gascon press conference, it's George Gascon and nobody else. You would actually think he prosecuted the case. If you've ever seen the way I've led, whether it's in the public sphere, in the Department of Justice, or in the private sphere in law firms, the whole point of Management 101 is to elevate the people below you, to get them more inspired, more committed, more owning every single day that they're on the job, that the mission comes first, and give them the credit. They do the great work, they should get the credit, and I am 100% committed to giving them all that credit. And that will build the esprit de corps to a point where I'm hoping after 4 years, the LADA's office won't be the joke that it is nationally. It will be the leader that it used to be.
Well, that's exactly right. It is a it's the national poster child for this far left extremism, and the people who are suffering are the people of Los Angeles. Last question before I ask you to let people know how they can follow you and support you. I just want to get into this party label thing and get your comment on that. There's 2 aspects to this I'm interested in. First of all, from the left, they're gonna for sure say, "Wow, he's not really independent. He's a Republican. He ran as a Republican for state attorney general." They'll probably call you a Trump MAGA, all the rest of it, right? Far right Republican. And from the right, I've heard some people say, well, we'd like, very happy. He's very qualified, great guy, really supported him for AG. I wish he'd stayed as a Republican and now he's gone to independent. Does that mean he's, kind of a bit of a flip flopper? So if you could just take both sides of that.
Absolutely. So basically, the first 20 years of my life, I was a centrist Democrat. The next 20 years, I was centrist Republican. And now I'm running for a nonpartisan position. And I've come down with the way the party, the registration everyone should have for that position, which is independent. And that's the way I intend to run the office. To the Democrats who think that somehow I'm a MAGA Republican, look at my record. I've been a centrist Democrat before I was a centrist Republican, and now I'm effectively a centrist as an independent. What does that mean? It means basically that I will be strong when it comes to their safety and security. And it's the same words that I've echoed literally for the last 40 years. When I started as a federal prosecutor, when I went to the US Department of Justice, when I switched to the defense side and actually represented people who the government charged with committing crimes, and I had to show that they either didn't do it or the government overcharged, asserting people's constitutional rights. I have a deep, deep respect for our criminal justice system and understand that the prosecutor needs to be the prosecutor. The defense attorney is on the other side. We have an adversarial system. What George Gascon has done is basically put the prosecutor on the side of the defense attorney and left victims unrepresented. I will go back to being victims' champions. And I think that Democrats, Republicans, independents want their district attorney to, again, hold people accountable, do it in a very smart way, bring the sensibility of both a prosecutor and a defense attorney to bear, and not create blanket policies like George Gascon has done of decarceration, but not return to the extreme policies of mass incarceration. I come down in what I call the hard middle. And the reason it's hard is you got to look at each and every case, rejecting blanket policies. Look at the defendant, the crime committed, the impact on the victim, and put the true threats to our public safety behind bars. And quite candidly, the ones that aren't. Your first-time nonviolent offender, they have to be held accountable, but community service or diversion is probably the right answer in many of those cases. So that's how I basically will appeal to Democrats, Republicans, and independents to beat George Gascon.
I think it's incredibly appealing. It's a very common sense, pragmatic message. It's what people want. It's what the city needs. And for what it's worth, I think that you are in the right place here because the Republicans want to get rid of Gascon, but they're in a minority in LA County. They'll definitely vote to get rid of him. And for Democrats who want to change, it'll just be easier for them to support an independent than go all the way to Republicans. So I think that it's very smart. We wish you the absolute best. This is going to be huge. I think there'll be a lot of focus on this race, national focus, because it's so symbolic of this terrible far left trend in criminal justice policy that needs to be reversed. So let's leave it there, Nathan. Just tell everyone where they can get involved, support you, follow you, and all the rest of it.
And thank you. Thank you again for having me on. So please go to my website, which is nathanhochman.com. That's nathanhochman.com. And I thank you for all your support. I've got to unify and want to unify the entire opposition. That's 75% of opposition to George Gascon. And I look forward to doing it with each and every one of you.
Yes. And if I could just add on your behalf, you need something to counterweight that Soros money that we know will be piling in to prop up this appalling man who's done such damage. Nathan Hochman, wonderful to see you. Let's check in closer to the election. We wish you all the best. Thank you.
Looking forward to it. Thank you again.
All right, here's something I want to get off my chest this week. It's just unbelievable, the double standard that is applied to anything to do with Donald Trump. But the example I heard on NPR this morning was so utterly, it's just stunning. I just wanted to share. I immediately thought, I've got to share this with my audience. Because most of you, I imagine, don't listen to NPR. I often say I listen to NPR, so you don't have to. I find it useful to see what's being said on all sorts of media outlets. I heard this morning, and I could barely believe it. Just listen to this. It's a report. I don't even know how it qualified as a news report, because it seemed like this kind of opinion piece, but it was literally in the news headlines, and it was about Donald Trump making the argument that Jewish Democrats should not support the Democratic Party any longer because of what I was talking about earlier in the show, the fact that Biden and the Democratic Party now is obviously completely abandoning Israel. Trump's been making that argument. Here's what NPR had to say about it.
Former President Donald Trump sent shockwaves through the Jewish American community and Washington when he said Jews who vote Democrat hate Israel. It's not the first time Trump has dabbled in what critics say are anti-Semitic tropes, nor more.
Amazing. So that is dabbling in anti-Semitic tropes. So Trump saying to Jewish people, you should vote for me, is anti-Semitic tropes. Anyone remember when Joe Biden said on that podcast in 2020, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black? No one said a word. And by the way, they're not even the same, because Biden was making that point purely based on identity. If you ain't black, right, it was your identity. If you're black, you should vote for Biden. Trump's not even making that argument. He's not saying you should vote for him because you're Jewish. He said you should vote for me because I support Israel. It was a substantive, policy-based argument. The Democratic Party has abandoned Israel, so you should support me. It's a perfectly legitimate, mainstream, perfectly normal political argument based on policy substance. Whereas with Biden, it really was pure racism. It was saying, if you're black, you vote for me. That's it. I mean, and this guy on NPR saying it's an anti-Semitic trope. What is anti-Semitic about it? It's the opposite. It's Trump expressing a pro-Israel point of view and saying that if you're Jewish, you should support that. Absolutely stunning. And again, it shows the media. I mean, the fact that got on the air, just absolutely zero self-awareness of how ludicrous they sound when they just literally any opportunity to attack and smear Donald Trump. And when they do all this, as I and others have said all along, just as with the lawsuits and all the rest of it, they just make him stronger. I mean, just as we discussed on the last episode with the bloodbath comment, it's all the same. They go totally over the top in their criticism of Trump, completely detached from reality. And then people just listen to that. Normal people, including not just Republicans or Trump supporters, just regular normal people, not even following politics that closely, saying, hang on a second, that seems a bit ridiculous. And so what that means is that they're more likely to support Trump. I mean, it is just a joke. This particular example, all the time you think, well, they can't get any more stupid. We thought that, I guess, with the bloodbath comment, but here we are, just a week later, they prove us wrong again. It seems there is no limit to their stupidity and absurdity when it comes to their Trump derangement syndrome. All right, everyone, that's our show for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Have you checked out Big Ideas Book Club yet? That is the new show we just launched, where we interview for an hour or so someone who's written an important new book with an interesting idea at the heart of it. I love this show. I'm really enjoying these conversations. I wanted to do it because sometimes we just don't have the chance on this show and the other things I do to get into these conversations. This week's episode, I know you will find absolutely fascinating. The brilliant Peter Schweizer, who's played such an important role in exposing corruption in our country in the swamp, particularly in recent years with the Biden family corruption. He's written an amazingly important new book about China. And I thought I followed China and all the politics around China really closely over the years. And I have to say, I really learned a lot from this conversation with Peter. It was absolutely fascinating. If you think you know what China's up to in terms of tech and fentanyl and all the rest of it, it is much, much worse, even than you've heard, much worse than you think. Peter Schweizer has the details. Please go and check it out. Big Ideas Book Club with Steve Hilton. And we'll see you back here, not next week, but the week after. I'm on vacation next week for Easter, so we're going to have a week off. Back soon after that with the next episode of The Steve Hilton Show.